Stellan Morvald had 14 cents, a 12-year-old brother, and a burnt cabin that nobody wanted. Aldous Blackwood, who had survived 19 Wisconsin winters, said it plainly in front of the whole town. "These two boys will freeze in their beds before Christmas. Nobody will find their bodies until the snow melts." On January 9th, 1872, the temperature dropped 43 degrees in 9 hours. But 3 months earlier, Stellan Morvald had never spent a single winter without parents. He had never felled a tree alone. He had never sealed a cabin by himself. He had never been responsible for keeping another human being alive. He arrived in Peshtigo, Wisconsin on a morning in May of 1871, when the sawdust hung so thick in the air he could taste it on his tongue. And the town smelled of cut pine and ambition, and the particular hope that draws people across oceans to places they have never seen. 800 men worked at William Ogden's woodenware factory, the largest in the world, people said. They turned Wisconsin timber into tubs and pails and clothespins and shingles that shipped down the river and across the Great Lakes to Chicago and beyond. Stellan was 17 years old. His father Ragnar walked beside him, broad-shouldered and steady, a carpenter's hands already rough from years of work. His mother Solveig followed with Viggo, who was 12, serious-eyed and quiet, always watching his older brother as if memorizing everything Stellan did. And there was Odin. The dog had been with them since Norway. A Norwegian elk hound with fur the color of storm clouds, silver gray and black, with a curled tail and eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. Ragnar had traded a week's wages for the puppy in Trondheim, and the dog had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of the ship with them, had survived 6 weeks of seasickness and despair, had walked beside them across half a continent to reach this place. Odin stayed close to Stellan, always had. The dog slept at the foot of his bed, followed him through the streets, sat beside him when he worked. If you wanted to find Stellan Morvald, you looked for the gray dog first. They had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach Peshtigo. Ragnar had a job waiting at the factory. $3 a day, enough to rent a cabin on the edge of town and save for land of their own. The cabin they rented was small, 12 by 14 feet. Single room with a dirt floor packed hard from years of use, but it had a cast iron stove that drew well, and the walls were tight against the weather, and Ragnar said they would build something better within 2 years. Solveig believed him. Stellan believed him. Viggo believed him. Summer passed in sawdust and sweat. Ragnar came home exhausted each evening, hands rough from the lathes, smelling of pine sap and honest labor. Solveig kept the cabin and tended a garden behind it. Stellan worked alongside his father at the factory, learning the trade, learning the wood, learning the particular way his father's hands moved when he shaped timber into something useful. Viggo helped their mother. He was too young for factory work, but old enough to carry water and stack firewood and watch over the garden when Solveig went to town. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the light was fading, Ragnar would sit with his sons and tell them stories. Stories from Norway, stories from the old country, stories about their grandfather who had built houses in Trondheim that still stood after 50 years, stories about their grandmother, whose cabin in the hills had walls dark with generations of smoke. Brent Trey Store Lenger, Ragnar would say. Burnt wood stands longer. He had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father before that. You char the ends of fence posts before you plant them. The burnt layer keeps water out, keeps rot away, makes the wood last twice as long as untreated timber. Stellan listened. He always listened. He filed these things away in his memory, the way some boys collected coins or carved wooden figures. I had knowledge from the old country, wisdom passed down through generations, things that might matter someday. He did not know how soon that someday would come. October arrived early that year. The summer had been dry, barely any rain since June, and the forests around Peshtigo crackled with fallen branches and dead slash from the logging operations. Small fires burned constantly in the clearings where settlers burned brush to prepare their land. Nobody worried. Fires were part of life here. On the morning of October 8th, 1871, the sky turned the color of a bruise, purple and yellow and sick-looking. The kind of sky that made old men shake their heads and young children cry without knowing why. By noon, the wind had risen. By 3 in the afternoon, ash fell like black snow. The air tasted of smoke and something else. Was something wrong? Ragnar did not come home from the factory. Solveig gathered her sons and walked toward town to find him. Stellan held Viggo's hand. Odin pressed close against their legs. They never reached the factory. The fire came not as flames but as a wall of heat. The air itself seemed to catch fire. Trees exploded. The ground burned. The sound was like nothing Stellan had ever heard. A roaring that swallowed every other sound, that filled the world until there was nothing else. People ran screaming toward the river, the Peshtigo River, the only water large enough to offer any hope of survival. Solveig ran with them, pulling her sons, her voice lost in the roaring. Stellan held on to Viggo with one hand and grabbed Odin's scruff with the other, and they ran. They reached the river as the fire roared over them. The water was cold. In October cold. Cold enough to steal breath and stop hearts. But the fire was hotter. The fire was death. Stellan waded in until the water reached his chest. Viggo clung to his neck, face pressed against his shoulder, small body shaking with sobs that Stellan could feel but not hear over the roaring flames. He looked for his mother. He saw her. 20 feet away, 30 feet. She was looking at him, mouth moving, saying something he could not hear. Her eyes were wide with fear and love, and something else, something that looked like goodbye. Then the flames swept across the water's surface, and he had to duck Viggo under, had to hold his breath, had to close his eyes against the heat that seared his face even beneath the water. When he came up, his mother was gone. 5 hours. That is how long they stayed in the river. So Stellan holding Viggo above the surface when the boy grew too weak to hold himself. Odin paddling beside them, gray fur blackened with ash, refusing to leave. When dawn came and the fires had passed, Stellan climbed out onto a bank that no longer looked like earth. Everything was ash, gray and black and silent. The trees were black spires. The town was gone. His parents were gone. 1,500 people died that night. Some estimates said more. 2,000, 2,500. Nobody would ever know exactly. Entire families vanished without anyone left to report them missing. They found what remained of Ragnar 3 days later, near the factory. They never found Solveig. Stellan Morvald was 17 years old. He had a 12-year-old brother who had not spoken since the fire, and he had a gray dog who had found them in the ruins and led the rescue workers to where they lay. He had 14 cents in the pocket of pants that smelled of smoke and river water. He had nothing else. The relief supplies came slowly. Chicago had burned the same night, the same hour, some said, and the great city's disaster swallowed the nation's attention while Peshtigo's dead went uncounted. What aid arrived was thin: flour, salt pork, blankets that smelled of other people's charity. The survivors gathered in clusters, sorting themselves by what they had left. Those with family elsewhere made plans to leave. Those with money rebuilt. Those with neither waited, hoping for something they could not name. Stellan waited with them. Viggo sat beside him, silent, staring at nothing. Odin lay at their feet, gray head on gray paws, watching. 3 weeks after the fire, a man named Aldous Thornton rode through what remained of the settlement. He worked for the Wisconsin Central Railroad. He carried a leather satchel full of papers and a pocket full of coins. The railroad wanted land. Burnt land was cheap land, and Thornton had authority to buy. He stopped at a charred structure on the forest's edge, a cabin that had somehow survived the inferno. Its walls were black as coal, charred 2 inches deep in places, but the roof was intact. The frame still stood. A lumber speculator had built it from green timber just that spring. The unseasoned wood had charred but not combusted. The speculator wanted nothing to do with it now. He had fled to Milwaukee and sent word that Thornton could sell the property for whatever it would bring. Thornton saw the 2 boys sitting among the refugees, the older one with the gray dog, the younger one with the empty eyes. He walked over. "You're the Morvald boys." Stellan looked up, did not answer. "I have a property." Thornton gestured toward the burnt cabin at the edge of the clearing. The railroad doesn't want structures. We want land. The cabin's worthless. Tear it down or live in it. I don't care. Stellan looked at the cabin. Black walls. Gaping window. A ruin that looked like something dragged from hell. How much? $1. Stellan had 14 cents. He needed 86 more. He looked at his brother, at the dog, at the burnt cabin that everyone else had walked past without a second glance. I don't have $1. Thornton shrugged, started to turn away. Wait, a woman's voice. Stellan turned. And she was perhaps 52, gray-haired, wearing a dress that had seen better days but carrying herself like someone who had once worn finer things. Her name was Dagny Bridwell. Her husband had been a lawyer in Peshtigo. He had died in the fire. She walked to where Stellan sat and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by anything anymore. How much do you have? 14 cents. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small purse, counted coins into her palm. 86 cents. She held them out to him. Take it. Stellan stared at her hand. I can't pay you back. I'm not asking you to. She pressed the coins into his palm. Her voice dropped lower. My husband spent his life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He kept records, legal documents, property surveys. She paused. If you survive this winter, come find me in Green Bay. I may be able to help you more than money ever could. Stellan did not understand what she meant, but something in her eyes told him to remember. $1. Stellan stood, walked to Thornton, dropped the coins into his hand. Thornton counted them, nodded, pulled a paper from his satchel, scrawled something on it, and handed it over. Congratulations. You now own a burnt cabin on burnt land at the edge of a burnt forest. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Stellan Morvald stood in the ash, holding a piece of paper that said he owned something. His brother had not spoken in 3 weeks. His dog pressed against his legs. Winter was 8 weeks away, and everyone in Peshtigo knew he was going to die. Stellan Morval was 17 years old, orphaned, responsible for a younger brother who had not spoken since the fire, with 14 cents in a burnt cabin that everyone called a grave. What would you do in his place? Most people would have walked away. Most people would have taken the train to Milwaukee and hoped for charity. But Stellan was not most people, and what he did next would change everything. Aldous Blackwood came to see him on the 3rd day. Blackwood was 63 years old, built like a barrel that had been left out in the weather for decades. His hands looked like they had been carved from the same oak he used for axe handles. He had arrived in Wisconsin in 1852, when the territory was still more forest than farms. He had built 7 cabins in 19 years. He had buried 2 wives, the first in childbirth, the second to pneumonia after a chimney fire that nearly took him too. When Blackwood spoke about winter, people listened. He had earned that authority with frozen fingers and dead livestock, and nights spent feeding fires while the temperature dropped to numbers that killed men who made mistakes. He walked around Stellan's cabin slowly, running his rough hand along the charred logs, peering at the gaps where the chinking had burned away, studying the roof where blackened shingles curled like dead leaves. Stellan watched him. Vigo sat inside the cabin, still silent, with Odin beside him. Finally, Blackwood turned. You know what this is? A cabin. No. Blackwood shook his head. This is a burnt shell. The logs are compromised. Fire weakens wood, makes it brittle. The chinking is gone. And in standard daubing, won't stick to a charred surface. You'll spend a month sealing these gaps and they'll crack open with the first hard freeze. He pointed at the stove, visible through the open doorway. The fire bricks are damaged. You'll get half the heat and twice the fire risk. He paused, let the words settle. A cabin this size needs 6 cords of wood to get through winter. 8 is safer. Each cord takes a grown man 12 to 15 hours to fell, buck, split, and stack. He looked around the property, at the charred stumps, at the ash-covered ground, at the complete absence of standing timber. You've got nothing. No trees worth cutting within a quarter mile. No help, no experience. His voice carried no cruelty, only the weight of hard facts. I've seen grown men try to winter alone in good cabins with plenty of wood. I've seen what happens to them. Stellan said nothing. He had learned in the weeks since his parents' death that men like Blackwood expected to talk while others listened. 2 boys alone? Blackwood shook his head. You can't cut enough timber. You can't keep a fire burning through a 30-below night and watch a sick brother at the same time. You can't survive this. What would you have us do? Go to Green Bay. Find the orphan trains. Find a family who'll take you in. Blackwood looked at the cabin again, at the black walls and the empty doorway. You'll die here, both of you, and nobody will find your bodies until spring. He said it the way a man states facts he has verified through decades of hard experience. Stellan looked at him, then at the cabin, then at his brother, visible through the doorway, sitting with the dog in the darkness. We have nowhere else to go. Blackwood held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has already written someone off. I'll tell the relief committee to check on you when it's over. He walked away without looking back. Stellan watched him go. Then he turned to face the cabin, the black walls, the gaps between the logs where wind would cut through like knives, the ash that covered everything. He thought about his father, about the stories Ragnar had told in the evenings after work, about fence posts that lasted twice as long when you burned them first, about his grandmother's cabin in Norway, with walls dark from generations of smoke, warmer than any other house in the village. The black warmth, his grandmother had called it. Stellan looked at his blackened walls, not at the charred surface that everyone said was ruin. He did not know if it would work. He did not know if any of it would matter. But it was better than waiting to die. October became November. The temperature dropped. The ash that covered everything turned to mud when it rained, then froze into a gray crust that crunched under Stellan's boots. The sky grew pale and cold. The sun rose later each day and set earlier each evening. Stellan worked. The first week, he gathered charcoal. The fire had left it everywhere. Fragments of burnt wood ranging from splinters to chunks the size of his fist. He filled buckets and dragged them back to the cabin, piling them against the wall he had designated for storage. Viggo watched from the doorway, still silent, still empty-eyed, but watching. Odin stayed close to both of them, moving between Stellan working outside and Viggo sitting inside, as if the dog understood that his job was to keep the family together, even if the family was now only 2 boys and 1 gray dog. The second week, Stellan found Clay, the riverbank, the place where he had stood in the water while the world burned, the place where he had last seen his mother's face. He did not want to go there. His feet felt heavy as he walked. His chest felt tight. But beneath the ash layer, the riverbank held deposits of dense gray mud. Clay. The same kind his father had used for chinking back in Norway. Stellan dug it with his hands. His fingers went numb in the cold water. His back screamed as he loaded the heavy mud into buckets. His heart hurt every time he looked at the water and remembered. But he dug. On the 3rd day of digging, his fingers touched something that was not clay. Fabric, embroidered fabric, waterlogged and mud-stained, but the stitching still visible. He pulled it free. A handkerchief. White linen, now gray with ash. Blue threads spelling out a name in careful stitches. Solveig, his mother's handkerchief. The one she had carried every day. The one his grandmother had embroidered for her wedding. Stellan sat down in the mud, the cold water soaked through his pants. He did not care. He held the handkerchief in his shaking hands and pressed it to his face, and breathed in the smell of river and ash and nothing else. No trace of her perfume, no trace of her warmth, nothing left but fabric and thread and memory. He heard footsteps behind him. Viggo, his brother, stood at the edge of the water, looking at the handkerchief in Stellan's hands. His face was pale, his eyes were wet. Mama, the first word he had spoken in 3 weeks. His voice cracked on it. Mama. Stellan opened his arms. Viggo fell into them, and for the first time since the fire, both brothers cried. They held each other on the riverbank while Odin pressed close against them, whining softly. They cried until there were no tears left, until the cold forced them to move, until the sun began to set and the temperature began to drop. Then Stellan wiped his face, folded the handkerchief carefully, put it in his pocket, close to his heart. They didn't die so we could give up. They didn't survive Norway and the ocean and everything else just for us to freeze in a burnt cabin. Viggo looked at him, 12 years old. Too young for this. Too young for any of this. Tom, will we be okay? I don't know. Stellan put his hand on his brother's shoulder. But I'm going to try, and I need you to help me. Viggo nodded, small and scared and determined. They walked back to the cabin together, Odin at their heels, the handkerchief in Stellan's pocket, the work waiting to be done. The third week, Stellan began to seal the cabin. He crushed the charcoal into smaller pieces, mixed it with the clay, added water from the river. The result was a thick black paste that smelled of fire and earth and something else. Something that reminded him of home, of Norway, of a world that existed before this one burned. He took a handful and pressed it into a gap between two logs. It stuck. The charred surface of the wood, rough and porous from the fire, gripped the black clay mixture better than smooth wood ever could. The paste filled the gap, sealing it completely. Stellan stepped back, looked at what he had done. Black chinking against black wood. Nearly invisible unless you look closely, but solid, sealed, complete. He did not know that he had created a primitive biochar clay composite. He did not know the scientific terms for thermal conductivity or heat retention. He did not know that the mixture he had made would prove to be 40% more efficient than standard clay chinking. He only knew that it felt right, that it used what the fire had left behind, that it was the only option he had. That night he sealed a 3-foot section of the north wall. Viggo helped, small hands carrying buckets of the black mixture. Small voice asking questions that Stellan answered as best he could. Why black? Because black holds heat, and white pushes it away. How do you know? Grandmother knew. She told father. Father told me. Viggo thought about this, then nodded, accepting it the way children accept things their parents tell them. Odin watched from his corner, gray head on gray paws, guarding them, watching over them, the way he had since they were small. Rana Holmgren came to visit on a morning when frost covered the ground and Stellan's breath hung white in the air. Ragna was 41 years old, a widow like half the women left in Peshtigo. Her husband had died in the fire, but she had brothers who had survived, strong men who were building her a new cabin on the edge of town. She slept in a tent beside the construction site, ate meals with her relatives, had people around her who would not let her freeze. She came, she said, must to see how the Morvald boys were managing. What she found was a 17-year-old covered in black paste, sealing gaps in a charred wall with a mixture that looked like it had been scraped from the bottom of a forge. What are you doing? Stellan did not stop working. Chinking. With what? Rana stepped closer, examining the dark mixture. Is that charcoal? Charcoal and clay? Yes. That's not how you seal a cabin. It's how I'm sealing this one. Rana watched for a long moment. Stellan, you're sealing burnt wood with burnt clay. This isn't building. This is covering ruin with more ruin. Stellan pressed another handful of mixture into the gap, smoothed it flat with fingers that had gone numb hours ago. The charred wood resists water. It doesn't rot. It doesn't soak up rain. Walls don't just need to resist water. Well, they need to hold heat. My father used to char fence posts before planting them. They lasted twice as long as the others. Fence posts don't need to keep children alive in January. Stellan finally turned to look at her. Touch the wall. He pointed to a section he had sealed earlier, where the morning sun had been striking it for an hour. Feel it. Rana hesitated, then placed her palm against the charred log. Her eyes widened. It's warm. The black surface drinks the sun. On clear days, this wall feels warm by afternoon, even when the air is cold. Pale wood pushes the heat away. Rana pulled her hand back, still skeptical, but thinking now. That doesn't mean it will work in January. Maybe not, but I have no money, no parents, and no way to cut 6 cords of firewood. Conventional methods won't save us. And so I'm trying something else. And if it doesn't work, then we freeze. Same as if I did nothing. She left without offering to help. At the edge of the property, she turned back. I hope you're right. I'll come back in February. We'll see what the cold has to say. The word spread. By mid-November, everyone in what remained of Peshtigo knew about the Norwegian orphan in the burnt cabin. Marcus Treadwell came first. He owned what was left of the general store. $5 for the property. He stood at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to step closer to the black cabin. That's generous, considering its condition. Enough for train tickets to Milwaukee. Not selling. You understand what winter means here? I understand. The railroad will wait. The cold won't. Stellan climbed down from the ladder slowly. When I die, you can buy the land for back taxes. When I don't die, you can find someone else to bother. Treadwell's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being refused, but he said nothing more, just turned and walked away. The Reverend Samuel Whitfield came next. A man of God, he said, concerned for the souls of two young boys trying to survive alone. The knowledge you're using. Whitfield stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking at the black walls. It comes from the old country? From my grandparents, and their grandparents before them. Pagan knowledge, wisdom from before the true faith reached your land. Stellan looked at the Reverend, at his clean clothes and soft hands. My grandmother went to church every Sunday. She also knew how to keep her family alive through winters that would kill men from softer places. Perhaps God is testing you. Perhaps he wants you to seek help from your community. I'm not refusing help. I'm refusing pity. There's a difference. The Reverend left without blessing the cabin. Horace Pemberton arrived the following afternoon. He was 50 years old, self-educated, proud of the engineering books he had ordered from Boston. He carried a notebook and a measuring tape, and the confidence of a man who believed that reading about something was the same as understanding it. He measured Stellan's walls, examined the chinking, made notes in cramped handwriting. Thermodynamics, he announced, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. I've studied the principles. Charred wood has higher conductivity than untreated timber. Your cabin will lose heat at approximately twice the rate of conventional construction. Stellan continued working. Did not look up. The science is clear, young man. You're not building a shelter. You're building a heat sink. You will see. Pemberton snapped his notebook closed. I've documented everything. When this cabin fails, at least there will be a scientific record of why. He walked away, already composing the letter he would write to the Green Bay Gazette about the foolish immigrant boy and his doomed experiment. Cormac Dawson came with 3 friends from the logging crews. Young men, strong, confident in the way of men who have not yet learned what winter can do. $2 says the Norski boy doesn't make it to January. Dawson said it loud enough for Stellan to hear. Any takers? His friends laughed, placed their bets, stood at the edge of the property and watched Stellan work. Dawson called out to him. Hey, orphan boy, building yourself a coffin? Stellan turned, looked at Dawson, at his friends, at their smiling faces. You will see. 3 words, quiet. No anger, no fear. The young men laughed and walked away, but something in Dawson's expression had shifted. Not everyone came to mock. Old Gunther Lindquist arrived on a morning when the sky was the color of iron. He was 70 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had come to Wisconsin before it was a state. He walked around the cabin slowly, touched the black chinking with trembling fingers, pressed his palm against the south wall, and held it there for a long moment. Then he nodded. My mother had a house like this in Uppsala, walls black from generations of smoke. Warmest house in the village. He looked at Stellan with ancient eyes. This boy knows something the rest of them have forgotten. Jonas Lindmark arrived 3 days later. He was 35 years old, lean, weathered, moving with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had decided that labor was preferable to thinking. He had lost his wife and 3 children in the fire, all of them, gone in a single night. He was walking to Milwaukee to find work because there was nothing left for him here. He stopped at Stellan's cabin because he saw smoke rising from the chimney and wanted to ask if he was on the right road. What he found was a 17-year-old splitting firewood with an axe too heavy for his arms, using a technique that wasted half the energy of each swing. You're doing it wrong. Stellan looked up. Show me. Jonas did. The axe needed to strike at an angle, not straight down. The wood needed to be positioned on the block a certain way. The follow-through mattered more than the initial swing. In 10 minutes, Stellan learned more about splitting wood than he had figured out in 6 weeks of struggling. I'll help you for the day, Jonas said, in exchange for a meal. He worked from dawn until dark. By nightfall, he had cut and split nearly half a cord of wood. Before he left, Jonas stood looking at the cabin, at the black walls, at the thick, dark chinking. Strange cabin, strange technique. He turned to Stellan. But it's warmer than it looks. He walked away into the darkness, heading south toward Milwaukee. Stellan never saw him again, never learned if he made it, but the words stayed with him. Warmer than it looks. Linnea Garrett started coming in late November. She was 19 years old, a daughter of the blacksmith who had survived the fire because he had been in Green Bay that week. She had dark hair and curious eyes and a habit of asking questions that other people were too polite to ask. Why does black hold heat better than white? Because black absorbs light. White reflects it. Light is energy. Energy is heat. Who told you that? My father, and his father before him. Did they explain the science? Stellan shook his head. They explained what worked. Maybe it's enough to know that something works without knowing why. Linnea thought about this, helped him carry a bucket of the black clay mixture to the east wall. My mother says you're going to die here. She might be right, but you're not leaving. No. Why? Stellan paused, looked at the cabin, at Vigo, visible through the doorway, and playing with Odin on the dirt floor. Because my parents crossed an ocean to give us a better life. Because my grandfather knew how to survive winters that would kill everyone in this town. Because my brother needs me to believe we can do this, even if I'm not sure we can. He turned back to the wall. Because giving up means they died for nothing, and I can't live with that. Stellan was 17, working alone to seal a cabin that everyone said was worthless, using techniques that everyone said were foolish. 6 people had already told him he would fail, but he had 2 supporters, an old Swedish man who remembered, a young woman who asked questions, and he had something else, something that couldn't be measured or weighed or written in Horace Pemberton's notebook. He had stubbornness, and sometimes that's enough. One night in late November, Stellan woke to find the woodpile smaller than it should have been. He counted the logs, counted again. A quarter of what he had gathered was gone, taken in the night while he and Vigo slept. He walked outside, found footprints in the frost, followed them toward the edge of the property. They led toward the Swenson cabin, half a mile to the north, a family of 5 who had lost everything in the fire and were struggling to survive. Vigo appeared beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Someone stole our wood. Yes, we should tell someone. Get it back. Stellan looked at the footprints, at the direction they led, at the knowledge of what he would find if he followed them. He thought about his father, about the things Ragnar had taught him that had nothing to do with carpentry or chinking or survival. And no, but they stole from us. They're hungrier than we are, more desperate. Stellan put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Father used to say that a strong man isn't measured by what he keeps. He's measured by what he gives when he has nothing to spare. But we don't have anything to spare. I know. Stellan looked at the cabin, at the black walls, at the work that still remained. We'll cut more, work harder, find another way. He never mentioned the theft to anyone, never confronted the Swensons, never asked for anything in return. He simply kept working. December 20th, 1871. The chinking was complete. Stellan stood in the clearing, looking at what he had built. The cabin was black from foundation to roofline, charred logs sealed with charred clay. A structure that looked like it had been dragged from a furnace. The few settlers who passed by on the road gave it wide berth, as if the blackness might be contagious. Inside, the stove burned steadily. The temperature held at 37 degrees despite the outside air reading 12 above zero. The gaps that had let in knife edges of cold air now admitted nothing. He had done the math obsessively. Wood supply, 2.3 chords, conventional requirement, 6 to 8 chords. But fuel consumption, approximately 1/8 chord per week, conventional consumption, 1/4 chord per week. His cabin was burning half the wood that a new-built cabin would require. At this rate, his wood supply would last until early February. Not comfortable, not safe, but possible. December 25th, Christmas. Vigo woke to small gifts. Wooden figures that Stellan had carved during stolen hours. A horse. A dog that looked like Odin. Vigo played with them on the floor while Stellan sat with his back against the south wall, feeling its warmth through his shirt. The cabin was 38 degrees inside. Cold, but not deadly. Blackwood's words echoed in his memory. You won't last until Christmas. Christmas had come. They were still here. But January was coming, and January, everyone said, was when the real cold arrived. The new year began quietly, January 1st. 8 degrees above zero. Cold but manageable. January 2nd. January 3rd. January 4th. Each day colder than the last. 8 degrees, then 2 above, then 5 below zero. Vigo had started talking again. Not much, not like before. But words came now. Questions, observations. Cool, how cold can it get? I don't know. Colder than this. Will the cabin hold? I think so. You're not sure? Stellan looked at his brother. I'm not sure of anything, but I trust what our grandparents knew, and I trust that we've done everything we could do. January 5th. The sky changed. High clouds streamed in from the northwest, thin and fast-moving. Mare's tails, the old settlers called them. They meant weather coming. January 8th. The clouds thickened. The temperature held steady at 12 below. Stellan fed the stove, watched the sky, and waited. January 9th, 1872. The morning dawned clear and cold, 14 degrees below zero. The sun rose into a sky that looked like polished steel. By noon, that sky had vanished. The clouds came from the northwest, moving faster than Stellan had ever seen clouds move. They swallowed the sun in minutes. At 1 o'clock, the thermometer read 18 below. At 3 o'clock, it read 22 below. At 5 o'clock, when the last light faded from the sky, it read 31 degrees below zero. The wind arrived with the darkness. It came screaming down from Canada at 40 miles per hour, carrying snow that flew horizontal, cutting through gaps in clothing like it was searching for skin. The wind chill dropped to 60 below. Stellan pulled Vigo away from the window. He fed the stove until it glowed. He checked the chinking, running his hands along every seam, searching for drafts. The cabin creaked and groaned around them. The wind shrieked. At 8 o'clock, Vigo began to cough. By midnight, he was burning with fever. The fever came on fast. 1 hour, Vigo was coughing. The next, he was limp in Stellan's arms, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and ragged. Stellan knew the signs. Croup, pneumonia. The diseases that killed 1 child in 4 before they reached age 5. In summer, you might survive them. In winter, with the temperature dropping and no doctor within 20 miles, they were death sentences. Stellan laid Vigo on the pallet near the stove, piled every blanket they owned on top of him, and began boiling water. Steam. That was what his mother had done. What her mother had done before her. Steam to open the lungs, to ease the breathing, to give the body a chance to fight. But steam meant boiling water. Boiling water meant fuel. And fuel was the one thing Stellan could not afford to waste. The stove consumed wood faster in extreme cold. At 30 below zero, with 40-mile winds, his cabin burned wood at nearly double the normal rate. The pile beside the door was shrinking by the hour. He fed the stove anyway. He had no choice. Vigo's breath rattled in his chest. His small body shook with chills despite the fever burning inside him. Stellan? His voice was barely a whisper. Are we going to die? Stellan held his brother's hand, felt the heat radiating from the small fingers. No, we're going to be fine. He did not know if it was true, but he said it anyway because that was what brothers did. 35 degrees below zero, wind at 40 miles per hour, a 12-year-old boy burning with fever. Stellan had enough wood to keep them warm for maybe 2 more days. Or he could use that wood to boil water for steam, to try to save his brother's life. He couldn't do both. What would you choose? January 10th. It's 3 in the morning. The temperature outside had reached 35 degrees below zero. The wind had not slackened. Inside, the thermometer read 30 degrees, cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough that the water in the bucket beside the stove had a skin of ice on its surface. Vigo's breathing had worsened. Each inhale was a wet rattle. Each exhale a moan. Stellan had been awake for 22 hours. His hands shook as he added another log to the stove. The wood pile. He had counted it at midnight. 5 days' worth at normal consumption. Maybe 3 at this rate. 3 days. If the cold held for 3 days, he would run out of fuel. Then the temperature inside would drop. Then Vigo would die. Then he would die. Blackwood had been right. They were going to freeze in this burnt cabin. Stellan looked at the woodpile, at his brother's flushed face, at the dog pressed close against Vigo's side. He thought about his parents, about the handkerchief in his pocket, about everything they had sacrificed. They had not done all of that so their sons could give up. Stellan added another log to the fire. Dawn came slowly on January 10th, a gray lightning that barely deserved the name. But something else was happening. Stellan noticed it first as an absence. The absence of the bitter cold that had been seeping through the south wall all night. He pressed his palm against the logs, expecting the chill that meant heat was bleeding out. The wall was warm, not hot, not comfortable, but noticeably warmer than the north wall. Warmer than the air inside the cabin, warmer than it had any right to be with the temperature outside at 35 below zero. The clouds had thinned, just slightly, just enough. The sun, low on the horizon, was finding its way through. And the black surface of the south wall was drinking every ray it could catch. Stellan stood there for a long moment, his hand against the charred wood, feeling the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. The wall that everyone said was ruin. It was absorbing sunlight that a pale wooden wall would have reflected. It was storing heat that a new cabin would have lost. He made a decision. He let the fire burn down, not out, but down, lower than he had ever let it go. The temperature inside the cabin dropped, 30 degrees, 29, 28. But the south wall kept warming. By noon, the interior of the cabin had climbed back to 32 degrees, with barely any fuel consumed. The cabin was holding, half a mile to the north. The Paulson family was not so fortunate. They had built their cabin in November. Fresh-cut pine, proper construction, conventional chinking. They had 5 cords of wood stacked outside. None of it mattered. The fresh pine walls conducted heat outward, like a sieve leaking water. The pale wood reflected what little sunlight reached it. The conventional chinking had cracked in a dozen places when the temperature plunged. By midnight on January 9th, the inside of the Paulson cabin had dropped to 24 degrees despite the stove burning at full capacity. By dawn on January 10th, the family made a decision. They could not stay. They bundled their 3 children in every piece of clothing they owned and set out for the Hendrickson place, a mile to the east. They made it, barely. The youngest child, a girl of 2, he would lose 3 toes to the cold. A reminder of the night the cold came hunting. Bronzemeyer, 3/4 of a mile to the west, made a different choice. His daughter, aged 7, had developed a fever the day before the cold snap hit. She needed medicine. The general store was 200 yards away, across an open field, 200 yards. He told his wife he would be back in 10 minutes. The wind caught him halfway across the field. The snow, blowing horizontal, erased the world in seconds. He could not see the store. He could not see his cabin. He could not see anything but white. He walked in circles for 20 minutes. His body temperature dropped. His mind clouded as the cold crept into his core. When they found him 3 days later, he was 20 feet from his own door. He had walked past it in the whiteout and never known. His daughter survived. The fever broke on its own. She would grow up without a father, killed by 200 yards of winter air. January 11th, the worst night. The temperature outside fell to 38 degrees below zero. The wind peaked at 50 miles per hour. Inside Stellan's cabin, the thermometer read 28 degrees. Cold. Desperately cold, but not killing cold. Vigo had been sick for 2 days. His fever had risen and fallen, each cycle a little weaker than the last. His cough sounded like tearing cloth. Stellan had not slept more than 20 minutes at a stretch since the storm began. The woodpile that had held 5 days' worth at midnight on January 9th now held perhaps 2 days' worth. But the sun had helped. On January 10th, he had let the fire burn low for 4 hours during the day without the temperature dropping below 30 degrees. He had saved perhaps a quarter day's worth of fuel. Not much, but something. Now it was night again. The sun was gone. The wind was screaming, and Vigo was worse. Stellan sat beside the stove, feeding it logs he could not spare, watching his brother breathe in wet, rattling gasps. Odin lay pressed against Vigo's side, refusing to move. At midnight there was a sound at the door. Not the wind, something else. A pounding, desperate, weak. Stellan rose, crossed to the door, opened it. Ragna Holmgren stood in the howling darkness, her 3 children clustered behind her, faces blue with cold, eyes wide with terror. "Please," her voice cracked. "Our cabin, the walls. My brothers left for Green Bay before the storm. We have nowhere." Stellan looked at her, at the woman who had called him foolish, who had said his techniques were madness. He looked at her children, at their chattering teeth and their frozen tears. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." Rana Holmgren had mocked Stellan's cabin, called it covered ruin, said he was crazy to try. Now she stood at his door with 3 freezing children, begging to be let in. What would you have done? Turned her away? Reminded her of everything she had said? Or would you have done what Stellan did? Open the door. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet, 168 square feet. By dawn on January 12th, it held 14 people. Ragna and her 3 children came first. Then the Swenson family, 5 of them, including the father who had stolen Stellan's firewood weeks before. He stood in the doorway, with shame in his eyes, unable to meet Stellan's gaze until Stellan simply nodded and stepped aside. Then Cormac Dawson, the young logger who had bet money that Stellan would die. He arrived alone, barely conscious, frost covering his face. Stellan dragged him inside and wrapped him in the last spare blanket. And finally, at dawn on January 12th, Aldous Blackwood. The old man limped through the door on feet he could barely feel. His face was gray. His hands shook. 2 of his toes had already turned black with frostbite. He looked around the cabin, at the black walls, at the thermometer that read 31 degrees despite the hellish cold outside. "How?" His voice was barely a whisper. "My cabin. Good construction. We burned everything we had and it still dropped below 20 degrees inside." Stellan did not answer. He was too tired for explanations. He guided Blackwood to a spot near the stove, found another blanket, made sure the old man was as warm as he could be. Then he turned back to his brother. Vigo lay on his pallet, still burning with fever, still breathing those wet, rattling breaths. Odin had not left his side. 14 people. 2 days of wood, maybe less, with this many bodies to keep warm. January 12th, 3 in the morning. Stellan was dozing by the stove when Vigo's breathing changed. The wet rattle was gone. The labored gasps were gone. In their place was something quieter, something steadier. Stellan's eyes snapped open. He pressed his hand to his brother's forehead. The fever had broken. Not completely. Vigo's skin was still warm, but the killing heat that had burned through him for 2 days had finally begun to recede. His body was fighting. His body was winning. Stellan sat back, covered his face with his hands, and wept. Odin lifted his head, looked at Stellan with those knowing eyes, then laid his head back down on Vigo's chest. Outside, the wind had died. The temperature was still brutal, 29 below zero, but the screaming gusts that had battered the cabin for 3 days had finally exhausted themselves. Dawn came slowly. Gray light seeped through the window, revealing a world buried in white. But the south wall was clear. The wind had scoured it bare, And when the sun finally broke through the clouds around 10 in the morning, Stellan watched the black surface begin to warm. He let the fire burn down to embers. Yet the temperature inside dropped. 28 degrees, 27. But he did not add fuel. He waited. By noon, the south wall was radiating heat he could feel from across the room. The temperature inside had climbed to 33 degrees without a single log added to the stove. The black wood drinking the winter sun, doing what everyone had said was impossible, keeping them alive. Blackwood was the first to understand. He had been watching Stellan, watching the way the young man let the fire die down when the sun came out and build it back up when darkness fell. The walls. Blackwood's voice was hoarse. The black walls. Stellan looked at him, waited. They're absorbing the sunlight, storing it, releasing it slowly. The old man shook his head. I've built 7 cabins. I never thought... My grandfather knew. Stellan's voice was quiet. Dark surfaces hold heat. Light surfaces push it away. In a Norwegian winter, every ray of sunlight matters. The chinking too? Charcoal mixed with clay. Better insulation than standard daubing. And it doesn't crack in extreme cold. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. I told you that you would die here. Told everyone in town you were building your own grave. Stellan nodded, waiting. I was wrong. The words came slowly, painfully. I was wrong about everything. Stellan did not gloat, did not remind Blackwood of everything he had said. Help me bring in some wood. The sun will set in a few hours, and we'll need the fire again. January 13th. The cold snap began to break. The temperature climbed to 18 below zero. Still brutal, but survivable. The sky cleared. The sun struck the south wall with full force. Inside, the temperature reached 41 degrees by mid-afternoon. Stellan stood in the center of the room and laughed. It was a strange sound. He had not laughed in months. Are we going to be okay? Viggo stood beside him, still weak but improving. Yes. Stellan pulled his brother into a hug. Yes, we're going to be okay. Around them, 14 people began to breathe again, and one by one they began to approach Stellan. Swenson came first, the man who had stolen Stellan's firewood, who had survived only because of what he stole. He stood before Stellan with his head bowed. I know you know. His voice was barely audible. The footprints, they led to my cabin. You could have reported me. You could have left us to freeze. Stellan looked at him. Owie, my father used to say that a strong man isn't measured by what he keeps. He's measured by what he gives when he has nothing to spare. Why? After what I did. Stellan glanced at Viggo. Because my parents didn't raise us to let people die when we could help them. Swenson's eyes filled with tears. I'll pay you back, everything. I swear it. Pay me back by being the kind of man who helps others when they need it. That's the only payment I want. Cormac Dawson came next. The young logger walked slowly, uncertainly. I bet $2 you'd be dead by January. I stood outside your cabin and laughed, called you names. I remember. And then I nearly died, lost in a whiteout. If I hadn't seen your chimney smoke, you would have frozen. Yes. Dawson finally looked up. His eyes were red. I was wrong. I and about everything. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills. I don't deserve to keep money I bet on your death. Stellan looked at the bills, then at Dawson. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? Learn, that's all. Learn that maybe the people you mock know things you don't. Dawson nodded slowly, pocketed the bills, held out his hand. Stellan shook it. Reverend Whitfield came on the second day after the storm broke. He did not speak at first, just stood in the doorway, looking at the cabin, at the people inside, at the black walls that had saved them all. I called your knowledge pagan. I suggested that God wanted you to abandon it. Stellan waited. I was wrong. Whitfield's eyes were wet. Your grandparents' wisdom saved 14 lives, including 3 children from my congregation. Whatever name we give it, tradition, knowledge, wisdom, it came from the same God who created wood and fire and the sunlight. He reached out, touched the black wall. I came to ask your forgiveness, and to ask if you would teach me. Come to the cabin when the snow melts. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Ragna Holmgren came last. She approached slowly, her children clustered around her. I called you foolish, said you were covering ruin with ruin, walked away when you needed help. Her voice broke. Left you alone with your mad ideas and your burnt walls. Stellan said nothing. Let her speak. And then my cabin failed. Everything the experts said to do, and it failed, and my children almost died. And the only shelter we could find was here, with you. She was crying now. How can you forgive me? Stellan thought about his parents, and about the life they had lost. My mother used to say that holding grudges is like carrying hot coals. You're the one who gets burned. He looked at Ragna's children. I don't have energy for grudges, but I know this much. We're all going to need each other when this is over. Rana nodded, wiped her eyes. Then teach me. Teach me what your grandfather taught your father. When the snow melts, I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. Moingoi Josai Vestellan. But he never gloated, never reminded them, never threw their words back in their faces. He just opened the door. Let them in, saved their lives, and when they asked for forgiveness, he gave it, because that's who his parents raised him to be. The spring of 1872 came late. The snow melted slowly, revealing a landscape that looked like a war had been fought across it. Burnt trees, destroyed buildings, the bones of the old world showing through wherever the white covering receded. But the people remained, diminished, scarred, forever changed, but alive, and they began to rebuild. 3 weeks after the cold broke, Dagny Bridwell came to visit. She arrived in a wagon driven by a man from Green Bay, carrying a leather case that had belonged to her husband. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone carrying something precious. Stellan met her at the edge of the property. Mrs. Bridwell. Mr. Morvald. She smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. I told you I would help you more than money could. I've been waiting for the right time. She opened the leather case. Inside were papers, dozens of them, land surveys, property deeds, legal documents covered in her husband's careful handwriting. My husband was a land attorney. Before he died, he was investigating the railroad's acquisition practices. She pulled out a specific document. This is the original survey of your property, filed in 1868, 3 years before the Wisconsin Central Railroad received its charter. Stellan looked at the paper. What does this mean? It means the railroad has no claim to your land. Eminent domain only applies to properties acquired after a railroad's charter is established. Your claim predates theirs. They cannot legally force you to sell. Stellan was silent for a long moment. Why? Why help me? Dagny looked at the cabin, at the black walls. Because my husband spent his life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And when I gave you those 86 cents, I saw something in your eyes. The same stubbornness he had. The same refusal to accept that something was impossible. She pressed the papers into his hands. He would have wanted me to help you. She climbed back into the wagon, paused. When the railroad man comes, and he will come, show him these papers, and tell him that if he has questions, he can contact me in Green Bay. I know every judge in this territory. The wagon pulled away. Stellan stood holding the papers, watching until it disappeared over the horizon. His land was safe, because someone had been watching. Someone had believed he was worth protecting. Aldous Thornton returned 2 weeks later. He rode the same horse, carried the same leather satchel. Mr. Morvald, I see you're still here. Stellan was repairing the chimney. Vigo was helping. Odin was watching from his usual spot near the door. I am. The railroad's offer still stands. $75 for the property. No. Thornton's eyebrows rose. The railroad has lawyers. We have ways of acquiring land when owners refuse to cooperate. Stellan climbed down from the ladder. Then tell your lawyers to talk to Mrs. Bridwell in Green Bay. Her husband was a land attorney. He kept records of every property transaction in this county. Stellan pulled the papers from his pocket. This land deed predates the railroad's charter by 3 years. You have no grounds for eminent domain? Thornton stared at him. Mrs. Bridwell is helping you? She helped me buy this property. She's been watching out for me ever since. Thornton was silent for a long moment. Then he gathered his reins. The railroad will route elsewhere. 2 miles east. He paused. You've won this particular battle, Mr. Morval. I'm not fighting a battle. I'm just trying to live. Thornton rode away. He did not look back. Stellan taught anyone who would listen. The technique spread from family to family, a piece of practical wisdom passed hand to hand. People stopped calling it strange. They started calling it the black chinking or the Morvald method. Within 2 years, at least 12 families in the Peshtigo area had adopted some version of Stellan's techniques. Several fire-damaged structures that owners had planned to demolish were instead repaired and occupied. He never charged for the knowledge, never sought recognition. When people came to learn, he showed them. When they left, he went back to his work. Marcus Treadwell never apologized, never admitted he was wrong, but he stopped offering to buy Stellan's land. And when he rebuilt his general store the following summer, he quietly hired Stellan to consult on the construction. He paid well. He said nothing about the winter, but the chinking on his new store was black. Horace Pemberton burned his engineering notebooks in the spring of 1872. He never spoke of thermodynamics again, but those who knew him well said he ordered new books that summer, books about traditional construction methods, books about the wisdom of people who had never read a textbook in their lives. The years passed. Vigo grew strong again. The fever that had nearly killed him left no lasting damage. He worked alongside his brother, learning everything Stellan knew, becoming the kind of young man their parents would have been proud of. Linnea Garrett continued to visit, to help, to ask questions. In the spring of 1874, she became Linnea Morvald. The wedding was small. Aldous Blackwood stood as witness. Ragnar Holmgren provided the food. They built a proper cabin that summer, not to replace the original, but to expand it. The burnt walls became part of a larger structure, the black heart of a home that grew around it. Vigo married in 1880, a girl from Green Bay. They moved to the northern woods, where he became a logger, then a foreman, then an owner. He always said that his brother had taught him the most important thing anyone ever taught him, that knowledge passed down through generations has value that cannot be measured. And Odin. The gray dog lived for 9 years after the Great Cold, 9 years of following Stellan through his days, of sleeping at the foot of his bed, of watching over the children that came, one by one, to fill the cabin with laughter and chaos and life. Odin died in 1881, 14 years old, ancient for a dog. He went peacefully in his sleep, curled in his usual spot near the door. Stellan buried him under an oak tree at the edge of the property, carved a simple marker from a piece of pine. Odin, who never left us. He told his children about the dog who had found him and Vigo in the ashes, who had stayed by Vigo's side during the worst of the fever. Without him, Stellan said, there would be no us. Never forget that. Sometimes the smallest, most loyal creatures are the ones who save us. Stellan Morval lived for 50 more years after the winter that was supposed to kill him. He became a carpenter, then a contractor, then something like a legend. The man who had survived. The boy who had built walls that everyone mocked and watched them outlast every other structure in the territory. In 1921, at the age of 67, he died peacefully in his sleep. The same bed where he had nursed his brother through fever. The same cabin where he had sheltered 14 people during the worst cold in 20 years. Vigo, 62 years old, stood beside the grave. He spoke the words their father had taught them half a century earlier. Words in Norwegian about family and endurance, and the knowledge that passes from generation to generation. Brent Trey Storlanger. Where burnt wood stands longer. In 1978, researchers from the University of Wisconsin came to the property. The original cabin still stood. 107 years after a 17-year-old orphan had sealed its gaps with charcoal and clay. They measured everything: thermal conductivity, heat retention, structural integrity. The results surprised them. Stellan's charcoal clay mixture demonstrated 40% lower thermal conductivity than standard clay chinking. The charred wood surface showed superior resistance to moisture and rot. The dark coloring absorbed significantly more solar radiation than untreated timber. They published a paper. Academic journals cited it. Architecture students studied it. What a 17-year-old orphan had figured out from memory and desperation. Modern science confirmed a century later. The charred house at 150 South Beebe Avenue still stands today. More than 150 years after the fire, its blackened timber is still visible, still intact, a testament to the wisdom of people who knew things before anyone thought to write them down. Stellan's cabin was not that house. His was smaller, rougher, less permanent. But it proved the same principle. Burnt wood is not ruin. It is a material that endures. Aldous Blackwood lost 2 toes that winter. He lived 15 more years telling everyone about the 17-year-old who taught him humility. Ragna Holmgren rebuilt her cabin with black chinking. It stood for 30 years. The Swenson family never forgot. Their children grew up paying forward the mercy they had received. And Stellan Mervald? Watched the boy with 14 cents in a burnt cabin? He lived, he built, he taught. He proved that sometimes the people everyone dismisses know more than anyone imagines. That sometimes what looks like ruin is the only thing that survives. The winter of 1872. 43 degrees dropped in 9 hours. 35 below zero with winds that cut through solid wood. A burnt cabin, a sick brother, 14 cents and a gray dog, and the memory of what his grandfather had taught his father. Every person who had mocked him, every expert who had said it was impossible, every voice that had told him to give up, he had listened, and then he had ignored them, and that made all the difference. The end. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. We have more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember Stellan Mervald. Remember that sometimes all you need is knowledge, stubbornness, and the courage to try what everyone says is impossible. Until next time.